Good morning to everyone joining us virtually today. My name is Anna Ashton. I'm a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Joining us this morning to talk about China's economic outlook and challenges is Asia Society President and CEO and Asia Society Policy Institute President Kevin Rudd. You may also know him as former Prime Minister of Australia. Kevin began his career as a China scholar, and he has employed that scholarship professionally throughout his working years in both private sector endeavors and public service. He continues to analyze, write, and speak prolifically on China-related matters today. His latest book, The Avoidable War, was published this spring and delves into the dangers of conflict between China and the United States. Managing US-China rivalry and avoiding all-out conflict is a defining challenge of this decade, a decade of living dangerously, as Kevin puts it. Navigating these dangers will demand skillful and disciplined diplomacy in governments. Moreover, it will demand astute awareness of each other's strategic thinking and priorities. As both Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia, Kevin negotiated with Chinese policymakers at the highest levels and was present for Australian government dialogues as far back as Deng Xiaoping. During his time as Prime Minister, he also, of course, dealt directly with Xi Jinping as a fellow head of state. These experiences and perspectives have uniquely shaped and continue to inform his analysis of China, of its foreign and domestic policies, its geostrategic ambitions, and its governance challenges. This morning, Kevin will share his own take on China's current economic headwinds, its policy options, and the political implications for Xi Jinping in what is truly a critical year for his tenure as China's leader. Xi Jinping remains widely expected to secure a record third five-year term at China's helm during this year's 20th Party Congress, fully cementing a historic break with modern precedent and essentially becoming president for life. But he's also contending with slowing economic growth, complicated by resurging COVID outbreaks, protracted lockdowns, continued travel restrictions and supply chain disruptions, and numerous other foreign and domestic policy dilemmas. While some of these dilemmas are the product of circumstances beyond Xi's control, others are arguably of his own making. Like you, I'm looking forward to hearing Kevin's thoughts on these matters. After Kevin's remarks, the second half of the hour is reserved for a Q&A discussion with him. You can post questions via the platform where you are streaming this program, and we may incorporate them into the discussion as time permits. Now, without further delay, let's turn it over to Asia Society President and CEO, Kevin Rudd. Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning, Anna, and thank you so much for hosting this event on behalf of the Asia Society. And greetings to all of those who are joining us from around the world, across our centres in the United States, across our centres across Asia, and across our centres in Europe as well. I've entitled these remarks Xi Jinping's Year of Instability. And the reason I've done so is because towards the end of last year, Xi Jinping instructed the party to ensure that 2022 was a year of stability, leading up to the party's 20th Party Congress, due to be held in November this year. But as events have unfolded during the course of the first quarter of 2022, it's been anything but stable. And I would like to argue this evening in Australia, where I am at the moment, this morning in America, and other times around the world, three core arguments. Number one, Xi Jinping is presiding over rapidly slowing economic growth in China, and that has been largely, but not exclusively, generated by policy choices of his own choosing. Number two, that in a response to this slowing growth, the Chinese system has begun various forms of policy course correction in order to return growth to a more acceptable level of activity. And three, while the jury is still out as to whether this course correction will work, it has raised doubts, among others, among Chinese political elites about the soundness of Xi Jinping's overall economic policy judgment. Secondly, this has combined also with question marks about the soundness. I'm sorry if that was an interruption. The soundness of Xi Jinping's direction on COVID policy, the zero COVID approach. And thirdly, on top of that, there are also parallel questions emerging in Chinese leadership elites about the extent to which Xi Jinping's judgment of being fully behind Vladimir Putin in terms of Putin's Ukraine policy has been the wisest course of action for the Chinese system. And that these three sets of factors combined now begin to create question marks around the final outcome of the 20th Party Congress in terms of the next leadership elite to take China into the 2022-2027 period. So let me try and break this discussion up into several discrete areas. The first is looking at the economy and how have we come about this set of circumstances where China's growth rate is slowing more rapidly than Chinese planners had anticipated. The first point I would make is this. When we look at China's growth projection for 2022, which the National People's Congress recently agreed upon should be 5.5%, the economic headwinds which exist to the Chinese system, which have been policy-induced, have been manifold. The first, of course, emerging in the year 2021 was Xi Jinping's so-called Common Prosperity Agenda, 共同富裕. And this, in the second half of 2021, assumed a general significance in China's propaganda and ideological and policy communications to its elite. And it was essentially a communication about more radical interventions to bring about more effective wealth redistribution within the Chinese system. Second, over the last several years, going back to earlier statements by Xi Jinping on the future of state-owned enterprises policy, there has been something of a revitalization of the significance of SOEs in China's overall economic framework. And this comes after several decades of previous Chinese leaders seeking to reduce the significance of SOEs because of their impact in the misallocation of critical financial resources and other resources within the Chinese economy. A third reason has been a parallel effort to reassert party control over China's private sector. This has been done at multiple levels, including the reinvigoration of the concept of party secretaries within private firms, but also dovetailing, of course, with what I've just described as the party's agenda to bring about greater wealth redistribution through Xi Jinping's Common Prosperity Agenda, but also through Xi Jinping's parallel agenda of the so-called mixed ownership model, whereby private firms are encouraged in certain circumstances to merge with SOEs, where SOEs are encouraged in certain sectors to merge with private firms, or to take mutual equity in each other's stock. On top of these policy choices and new directions by Xi Jinping has been his so-called economic self-sufficiency agenda, 自力更生, which has become more prominent in China's ideological and policy discourse in recent years. In effect, it's China's own code language for varying degrees of decoupling from the United States and the rest of the collective West. And the logic for this level of economic decoupling has been that if the United States, through the trade war of 2018-19, is no longer to be reliable as a supplier of China's essential economic inputs in the future, for example, in critical computer parts, and on top of that, whether in fact there is a wider concern that the United States and its allies may take action in the future, either in financial sanctions, technology sanctions, or even trade sanctions. This has reinforced on Xi Jinping's part a predilection to bring back an ancient Chinese concept of national self-sufficiency, which last received full support by the Chinese leadership during the period of Mao Zedong. And on top of these sets of policy measures, there have been two other measures of a particular sectoral nature, which have also had a radical impact on slowing economic growth. The first has been in China's property sector, beginning with significant actions against the Chinese property conglomerate Evergrande resulting in a series of measures by the Chinese regulators to reallocate Evergrande's assets in order to deal with Evergrande's accumulated debt, which in various quarters has been calculated into the tens and perhaps hundreds of billions of US dollars equivalent. This, of course, has led to a wider deleveraging strategy, not just targeted on Evergrande, but other major Chinese property firms, such as Kaisa, together with about 7 or 8 in the overall Chinese property sector. Of course, the problem here is that the property sector represents some 29% of Chinese GDP and has managed to expand rapidly based on loose credit and ever-increasing property prices. But now, through the deleveraging program adopted by the leadership, these assumptions no longer apply for the future. And there's been a significant write-down in the value of property-related assets in the Chinese system since this program began of deleveraging within the sector during the course of 2021. It's also been reinforced at an ideological level beyond the desire to reduce financial risk and instability to the system by an overly leveraged property sector and by an ideological instinct on Xi Jinping's part to attack what he sees as the sources of China's fictitious economy, namely property sector finance-driven speculation, as opposed to what he juxtaposes that with the real economy, made up of manufacturing, made up of technology services, etc. If there's been one final policy direction by Xi Jinping in the last year or two, which has further put downward pressure on economic growth rates, it's been his parallel attack on the China tech sector. This has been done through the justification provided by China's antitrust laws and an assault on what Xi Jinping and the regulators have inferred as being an excessive abuse of monopoly power by the likes of Alibaba, Tencent, and others, including the new entrants to the market, such as Didi. The result of all this has been to see some $1 trillion in terms of stock exchange valuations being wiped off markets as a consequence of this regulatory assault on the sector. We put all these factors together, that is the common prosperity agenda, the reinvigoration of SOEs, the greater levels of party control and direction of private sector firms, the rebirth of Chinese industrial policy at scale, the new and re-emerging doctrine of national self-reliance as a form of economic decoupling, plus the particular regulatory measures adopted towards the property sector and, of course, the tech sector. All these have brought about significant impacts on China's overall economic growth levels. At its core point, what has happened is private sector business confidence has taken a huge hit. And this has been reflected into much slower growth in China's officially recorded private sector or private fixed capital investment. Second, how has this been reflected in terms of China's faltering economic growth numbers? Well, as I indicated in my comments before, China's officially endorsed growth target for calendar year 2022 is 5.5%. At the end of the first quarter of 2022, the number produced in China's national accounts data for that quarter has been a quite surprisingly high 4.8%. In other words, not that far off the 5.5% annual projection. However, very few public economists and very few private economic research institutes have accepted the validity of the 4.8% figure. It simply doesn't tally with a whole range of other indicators of more faltering economic growth numbers during the months of January and February and March in particular. And of course, there's a further factor which I'll come to in greater detail soon, and that is China's continued and ever-expanding zero-COVID strategy, particularly since the beginning of March, has begun to lock down a whole range of Chinese cities and effectively freeze economic growth activity within those cities until the virus has been eliminated from those metropolitan centres. Put all these factors together, there are a range of different calculations as to where China's real growth rate is likely to land in calendar year 22. None of them approach 5.5% as the party suggests. Some of them, like the IMF, are now down with a 4 in charge of it. But a number of private sector market analysts are now pointing to a growth number for the Chinese economy for calendar year 22 of somewhere between 2 and 3%. This means we have arguably the single biggest correction in China's economic growth levels in something like 30 years. We haven't seen growth levels fall to this level really since the immediate aftermath of the financial and economic sanctions imposed upon China in the years immediately following the Tiananmen massacre back in 1989. The question arises, therefore, is if these measures have been in fact created by a range of policy decisions executed under Xi Jinping himself, then under those circumstances, can he credibly engineer a course correction in order to reactivate growth levels? This, of course, turns on our analysis as to what has driven this slowing in China's overall economic growth in the first place. I've just pointed to a series of policy measures which relate to particular sectors, the private sector, as well as the state and enterprise sector, as well as Chinese industrial policy and self-sufficiency policy. I've also touched on the economic impact of China's zero COVID approach and the fact that you now have large slabs of economic activity, and not just in Shanghai itself, China's largest commercial centre, being effectively frozen as a result of the lockdowns being imposed in order to bring COVID back under control, but a very large number of additional cities around the country. There have been varying estimates as to how extensive this is, but something like 1/4 of Chinese total economic activity is now believed to be affected by one form of lockdown or another. Of course, there is another factor at play in China's overall slowing economic growth rate, and that has to do with the war in Ukraine, which also erupted in February. In the case of the Ukraine war, the dimensions of the impact on the global economy are yet to be fully determined. What the analytical community has agreed on so far, however, is that at a minimum, we have seen a massive release of inflationary pressures into the global economy, coming about through the dual impact of the Ukraine invasion on global energy prices and global agricultural commodities. And this, in turn, has flowed through to the rest of the global economy and through that back into the Chinese economy. So therefore, we see inflationary pressures writ large, resulting in turn in a further reduction in the IMF's calculation for global economic growth for this calendar year as well. And if global economic growth is slowing, then it follows that global demand for Chinese goods and services will also be corrected, quite apart from the indigenous impact of inflationary pressures on China's domestic growth. For those reasons, we have these three sets of headwinds. Domestic policy change on the one hand. Number two, the rolling impact of Xi Jinping's zero COVID strategy. And number three, the national and international economic impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, particularly on global inflationary pressures and general global corporate confidence, and business risk. There is some evidence that Xi Jinping and those around him, led by Premier Li Keqiang and the Vice Premier responsible for the economy, Liu He, have begun in the last part of 2021 and into 22 to bring about some levels of course correction. We see this with new and more qualified language concerning the common prosperity agenda. In fact, recent statements by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang himself have barely mentioned the common prosperity agenda. There is a sense that this is now being pushed into what we describe in my country, Australia, as the long grass. That is, a long way away from the current action. Secondly, in the property sector, there's been some indication of a relaxation in the deleveraging strategy being applied to the property sector. There's been some relaxation in the supply of credit to the sector. And therefore, there is some expectation there may be some recovery in the sector overall. However, this should be qualified against Xi Jinping's enduring ideological distaste for a property sector based on speculation rather than, as he said explicitly on earlier occasions, a sector which is designed to build houses for people to live in. Similarly, there has been some relaxation in the regulatory assault on the tech sector, and recent meetings convened by various representatives of the central leadership and the tech sector in order to restore confidence and growth in these dynamic firms of the past. And furthermore, in the broader discourse on the economy, we find a range of senior Chinese leaders re-emphasising the paramount importance in 2022 of the watchword economic stability, and therefore under those circumstances disencouraging provincial, subnational and municipal officials from implementing any policies capable of undermining macroeconomic stability, capable of undermining stable growth, or creating disturbance in terms of China's overall growth target of 5.5% for calendar year 2022. The question then arises as, will these course corrections that I've just described have a material effect in restoring growth during the rest of this year? The argument I would advance on that question is that if we look at the initial data provided by, for example, the IIF, the International Institution of Finance, and its tracking of international financial flows, the outflow of capital, both foreign direct investment and portfolio investment from China in the first several months of the calendar year 2022 has continued into April. There is little evidence so far of that capital outflow being arrested as a consequence of the policy assurances now being delivered by various arms of the central leadership in terms of the country's overall economic policy direction. And there's a further complicating factor as well. Whereas what I've just listed before are a number of course corrections, both in terms of the common prosperity agenda, both in terms of the tech sector, the property sector, and a general quest to restabilise economic growth. At the same time, we find from other spokesmen for the economic system continued statements of the need to drive home the reform initiatives already announced in terms of the overall deleveraging of the Chinese economy. In other words, the Chinese system at this stage is not speaking with a uniform economic voice. There are many voices still prosecuting the Xi Jinping agenda from last year, which was in a more left direction, as well as those being promoted by Li Keqiang and Liu He and others like Han Zheng in the system, which are pushing back in a more pro-market direction. It is therefore of little surprise that the Chinese private sector remains confused, somewhat on edge, and with private fixed capital investment decisions continuing to be deferred. This brings us to the critical question of to what extent are we likely to see any relaxation in the party's policy of zero COVID, given this is a further area where we've had an enormous impact on economic activity, particularly since February. If there was any debate or doubt about the likely continuation of this strategy for the future, I think that was put to rest by a remarkably clear set of statements by the Standing Committee of the Politburo on the 5th of May, in other words, only several days ago. That statement by the Standing Committee of the Politburo made absolutely plain that the central leadership, led by Xi Jinping, intends to prosecute the zero COVID strategy for the long term throughout 2022, and with no exceptions being made. In fact, what we see in this defiant statement from the Standing Committee of the Politburo is determination to, quote, wage struggle, 斗争, unquote, against those who might in any way oppose the continuation of this central line on zero COVID strategy for the duration of this year. So therefore, at an analytical level, for those expecting that some later year COVID easing, zero COVID policy easing, will therefore rapidly restore economic growth levels, that is not going to happen. What may happen is if the Chinese system succeeds in, quote, containing COVID domestically, that there may in fact be some prospect for economic activity to recover of its own accord. But the risk will continue of future variants of the current COVID virus continuing to jump the border, whether it's from Hong Kong or from elsewhere, as occurred in relation to the Omicron transfer, which occurred in January or February of this year. So in other words, there will be no course correction on COVID policy. And as for the other dynamic at play, which is driving Chinese growth rates down, and namely the war in Ukraine, there is little evidence so far that that war is going to end anytime soon. And in fact, Xi Jinping has indicated very little predisposition to use his political leverage with Vladimir Putin in Moscow to arbitrate a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. And in fact, China is still, for geopolitical reasons, likely to at best remain on the sidelines, or at worst continue to maintain an expansive relationship with Moscow during this period as the Russian economy comes under further financial and economic pressure from a combination of financial and, it seems, looming trade sanctions concerning European imports of Russian energy supplies. So for those reasons, I argue that we are now likely to see efforts by the Chinese government and the Chinese party to plug the emerging significant economic growth rate within China by renewed economic stimulus. Economic stimulus not just of a monetary policy variety, which we've already seen some modest signs of, but much more significantly, fiscal policy stimulus delivered through a renewed bout of infrastructure investment. And for those who doubt that, there's been an important meeting convened by the Politburo on the 26th of April, which commissioned a new round of infrastructure investment, large scale, medium scale, small scale, but against the new rubric of China's emerging and more complex and extreme national security circumstances, that China must now double down in the provision of investment into its overall economic infrastructure, ports, rail, electricity, telecommunications, and the rest. In my analysis, the writing is now very much on the wall that we're about to see yet another debt-fueled, large-scale investment by the Chinese state and party into a major infrastructure boom for the country at large. This has one political and policy objective: to plug the growth gap. Remember, in the Chinese political system, the leader can never be wrong. If the proposed growth number for 2022 is 5.5, and if economists are generally correct that the real number is somewhere for growth in the vicinity of 2 to 3% for calendar year 22, it means that there is something in the order of a 2 to 3 percentage point growth gap to be filled by fiscal stimulus. This means that we're looking at a very large set of activities in this sector overall. And given the time that we now are in, which is already well into the second quarter of the year, for this to be accelerated immediately. Let me conclude my remarks by asking this question of where, in fact, this all leads in terms of the politics of the 20th Party Congress at the end of the year. As I said in my remarks at the outset, there is critique within China about the extent to which Xi Jinping's adjustment of the traditional successful Chinese economic growth model of the past has now been undermined by his deliberate shift of the centre of economic gravity to the left in so many instruments of public policy, reinforced by his decisions on zero COVID management and reinforced by his tacit support for Russia's continued military engagement in Ukraine. So the question arises as to how this will flow through in the remaining 6 months between now, where we are in May, and when the 20th Party Congress convenes in Beijing in November. On balance, my conclusion still is that because of Xi Jinping's firm hold of the party's internal political, security and intelligence apparatus, and his absolute control of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, having reshuffled their leadership on several occasions since he became leader of the Chinese Communist Party and chair of the Central Military Commission back in 2012-13, that under these circumstances, it still remains highly probable that Xi Jinping will be reappointed for a record third term as General Secretary of the party this coming November. However, there is a much more important debate which I believe is emerging, and that is the extent to which the criticisms of Xi Jinping's policy direction on the economy, on COVID and on Ukraine combine in order to support the appointment of a range of other personnel to senior positions within the Standing Committee of the Politburo itself, and the wider Central Committee, who are not simply Xi Jinping acolytes. In other words, persons of a more independent and critical mind. This, I believe, is where the analytical effort will be put into our analysis through the Asia Society and other institutions in the United States and elsewhere in the world on the unfolding political debate in China about the composition of the new leadership after this November. Will, in fact, the rest of the leadership continue to have absolute confidence and blind obedience to Xi Jinping's policy direction in the future if they collectively conclude that errors have been made in terms of Xi's call on core economic policy decisions, on zero COVID approach, as well as on foreign policy concerning Russia and Ukraine? It is too early to predict whether that will happen, but this debate is now on well and truly in earnest. So thank you very much for your attention so far. Back to you, Anna, for a discussion on the matters raised in the remarks I've made on this year of instability as we move towards the 20th Party Congress this November. Over to you.
Wow, a lot to cover. Okay, Kevin, why don't we start out with this question? You suggest that Xi Jinping remains unlikely to lose his grip on power to the point of failing to secure a third term this year. But you've also noted towards the end of your remarks that his ratcheting up of political control over people's daily lives and his crackdown on major parts of the private sector are generating resentment and undermining confidence in his leadership. So do you see any clear potential tipping points on the horizon? And if so, what might they be?
If we were to end up in a situation, Anna, where something dramatic occurred, which was capable of acting as a political catalyst to bring together all these disparate threads of policy discontent with Xi Jinping's leadership, then in fact, things can move relatively quickly in that system to bring about dramatic political change through a purge, that is, a purge of Xi Jinping himself. What I find difficult analytically, however, is to find what that event could be of such an order of magnitude, which would push the system into such a position of political extremists that they believe they had to act. Two or three theoretical possibilities are as follows. Vladimir Putin was to fall, not just fail in Ukraine, but fall from political office. Now, I'm not an expert in Russian domestic politics, and my Russian analytical friends tell me that outcome is highly unlikely, given Putin's control over the domestic political system within his own country. If, however, Ukraine went from bad to worse from a Russian perspective, and Putin did fall, this would send shockwaves into the Chinese political system, given the extent to which China has placed most of its strategic bets with Putin's Russia for the future. That would be one. If I could hazard one other guess, it would be if the zero COVID strategy ended up in a series of long-term lockdowns beyond what we've already seen with a 5-week plus lockdown in Shanghai, but across many of the other major cities of the country, and on a recurring basis, that China doesn't quite escape from this loop. Remember, in China, there's a problem in terms of low vaccination rates and low effective vaccination rates among older people in particular. The level of public disquiet about this impact on everybody's lives if you've got any friends at the moment in Shanghai and speak to them about what it's like being locked up for 5 weeks without proper access to fresh food, for example, and proper access to food and medical supplies, and the appalling footage recently of a man who was not dead being pulled out of his apartment believed to be dead until he cried out, "I'm not dead yet." This is having a profound effect on the party's overall credibility in the eyes of the Chinese public. But the security apparatus are well and truly capable of keeping a lid on this, unless it becomes seriously a long-term stratagem where large slabs of the country are locked down not just for the next few weeks, but for the next several months or through to November itself. This would become a major management concern for Xi Jinping himself.
I want to follow up on both the Putin piece and the COVID lockdown piece, but I'll start with Ukraine, since that was next on my list anyway. So I think that what you've posed as a potential tipping point, Putin falling from power, helps to explain a little bit the question I was going to ask, which is, can Xi Jinping reasonably sustain this ambiguity that he's tried to create in China's stance on Ukraine? And can you unpack for us some of the reasons why Xi is not stepping up to what seems to be an opportunity on the international stage to be seen as an important voice in mitigating Putin's aggression? Surely he understands that the situation in Ukraine is a liability for him in terms of his relationships with Europe. Are we missing a more broadly shared perspective that might be emanating from developing countries? Why is he so firm in his position of at least ambiguous support for Putin? Does it come down to this huge vulnerability if Putin falls?
I think that is one part of the equation at the back of Xi Jinping's mind. But I think a more prominent concern in people's mind is this, namely that China has enormous geopolitical equities in the overall relationship with the Russian Federation. And that is, they want a benign relationship with Moscow under all circumstances, because China does not want to return to a stage where it has an insecure border with Russia, requiring the deployment of Chinese military assets in any significant order of magnitude to its vast common border with the Russian Federation. Secondly, it wants to therefore be able to be completely free to focus all of its strategic efforts on managing its real global competitor and potential adversary, the United States. And third, Russia is actually helpful on that score by providing problems for the United States in secondary and tertiary theatres around the world, like Syria, like Libya, and now as in Ukraine. And finally, from China's perspective, if in the future they were to face pressures themselves in terms of global energy supplies and global commodity supplies, global agricultural supplies, they would prefer to have Russia, a huge commodity exporter, being a reliable and adjacent supplier of those commodities to China itself. Often in our collective Western mind, we assume it must therefore be in China's self-interest to want to ameliorate this dreadful conflict on the ground in Ukraine. But it's my melancholy duty to reflect, Anna, that's not the way Beijing sees these things. Therefore, I think the prospect of that occurring is remote indeed.
I think it's important. It's an important reminder that what we think of as what should be the obvious priorities for Xi Jinping or for China often misses a lot of the key drivers from their own perspective. So I guess building on that, what are the lessons learned for Xi Jinping and Beijing in the crackdown on Hong Kong? It seems to have fueled anxiety in Taiwan, along with political resolve in Taiwan to push for stronger security ties with the United States. Is that something that Xi Jinping likely recognizes as a rebuke of his handling of Hong Kong? Is he less likely to pursue an aggressive policy towards Taiwan because of Ukraine, or are both of those sort of off base when considering China's perspective on these matters, Beijing's perspective?
Once again, it's my melancholy duty to say that it's off base, because that's not the way in which the Chinese view these strategic realities. In the case of Hong Kong, Beijing regards their move on Hong Kong as a great strategic success. The Hong Kong democracy movement represented a domestic threat to the Chinese Communist Party because they feared contagion across the Chinese border. If you like, it was the political equivalent of a COVID virus. They saw this thing spreading, that if you can have an umbrella movement of protest in Hong Kong, well, why not have one in Guangdong? Why not have one in other parts of the country? And so therefore, China was determined not to allow this precedent to be left uncorrected, and they acted forcefully. Secondly, from the Chinese Communist Party point of view, it was a success because apart from a bit of huff and puff from the United States and a few financial sanctions here and there targeted against individuals, the United States just did not decide to impose against China anything like the sorts of measures they've just imposed on the Russian Federation. Chinese full access to international dollar-denominated, US dollar-denominated financial system was sustained. There was no suspension of China from SWIFT, and China's ability to operate in US dollar-denominated capital markets remained unimpeded. From China's point of view, therefore, this was full of huff and puff, and frankly of no material, military or economic substance. And finally, on the Ukraine point, which you raised, let me add this. Chinese propaganda directed towards Taiwan in the period since the Ukraine war erupted has got nothing to do with their indirect complicity with Russian actions, nothing to do with the brutality of what Russia has done on the ground in Ukraine against civilians. It is focused on one thing and one thing alone. Look, guys, neither the United States nor the Europeans lifted a military finger to directly assist Ukraine in their war against the Russians by the provision of troops on the ground. And what the Chinese have said in East Asia, directed at the Taiwanese, but elsewhere, is, look, guys, when it comes to your future, you will also be on your own. And furthermore, implied in all that is, it is somewhat easier to resupply the Ukrainians by way of military equipment across land borders shared with a range of countries, including Poland. But when you come to resupply Taiwan with military equipment, given it's an island, and you would have to access what by that stage could well be a Chinese maritime blockade, that becomes a far more difficult proposition. So to assume, therefore, that what's happened in Ukraine or what's happened in Hong Kong have acted as it were, negative lessons learned for the Chinese system about what not to do, they will observe closely Western reactions to all of these developments. But I do not see them ultimately deterring a predisposition by China to act when it believes it's militarily and financially powerful enough to do so.
Interesting that our restraint vis-a-vis Ukraine in terms of military assistance might actually be read optimistically by Xi Jinping and others in China's military leadership. I know you've noted that Xi Jinping has a history of stoking nationalism at home when he needs to shore up political support, and that this may also be a moment where doing so is useful as a counterbalance against popular opposition to some of his other policies. How might that affect the likelihood of China moving on Taiwan in the near term?
This is a very complex question. It's worth working our way through it reasonably slowly. I think the first point to be made is this, that domestically, as you just indicated, neither his move to the left on politics, that is, more power for the party, more power for me, Xi Jinping, within the party, against the normal functionings of the Chinese state and administrative system and the freedoms of individuals which existed prior to the Xi Jinping period. Because this is unpopular, it is a problem in terms of party legitimacy within the country. Secondly, the move to the left on the economy is also creating problems because slower economic growth means less rapid rise in living standards. It also means people in the private sector being less happy than they were before. It also may mean less, as it were, public finance available in order to fuel China's long-term military expansion. So for both those sets of reasons, but principally the domestic political legitimacy reasons, it creates a problem. Hence why, secondly, it's important for leaders like Xi Jinping to be able to pull the nationalist lever in order to use that to offset any loss to the overall legitimacy equation domestically, occasioned by the political and economic policy changes I referred to before. In other words, nationalism fills that political vacuum. But then thirdly, the problem becomes how is that translated into action? And this is where we end up in a real dilemma. Can leaders like Xi Jinping, as others have done in authoritarian systems in the past, simply push the nationalist lever forward? Domestic sentiment is then exorcised and directed against, be it the Taiwanese, the Japanese, the Americans, or whomever else, but not to the point of actually tripwiring crisis, conflict, and war? Or does it therefore, under those circumstances, become so powerful an ingredient in the legitimacy equation that in fact it becomes more difficult to resist the creation of crisis, conflict, or even war? There's a long debate in the academic literature on this subject, which is, can Chinese nationalism ultimately simply be controlled, turned off and on? It's called the spigot thesis of Chinese nationalism. Or do you have the Frankenstein monster theory of Chinese nationalism, which is once you unleash the furies from Pandora's box, then what then happens in terms of it becoming a self-generating force within itself, which pushes the whole Chinese body politic in a direction which may not ultimately be the most rational direction from the perspective of Chinese national security policy planning? I think all those factors are alive at present, which is why I do describe this as a decade of living dangerously. And within that frame, a slowing Chinese economy, which is the burden of my speech today to the Asia Society, therefore creates real political and foreign policy consequences of the type which perhaps we've not fully thought through. And if this slowing Chinese economy continues into the future, and China continues to falter economically in the future, then in fact does nationalism become more of a problem than we've ever known it to be in the decades since China's rise began.
Indeed. I mean, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its great achievement in the last 30 plus years really has been the economic development that it has successfully achieved for the Chinese people. And as you've noted, Xi is engaged in efforts to revive the role of the state in China's economy, and these aren't new efforts. His consolidation of state-owned enterprises, his push to cultivate China's self-reliance across a broad range of industries, his unapologetic embrace of bold industrial policy, these all fly in the face of China's WTO commitments and also have a history that goes back years. For instance, Made in China 2025, perhaps the most well-known piece of Xi's industrial policy architecture. That's the set of policies that was first rolled out in 2015, I think. Industrial policy proposals have become pretty popular here in Washington as a response to the competitive challenges posed by Beijing. Is Xi getting something right here, or is he fundamentally missing something? Are we missing something when we think about how to respond to this?
Within the matrix of industrial policy, we're kind of left with a three bears type analogy and a Goldilocks golden mean somewhere in between. Chinese industrial policy is what I would describe as capital I industrial policy. To use the three bears analogy, way too hot. The absence of any industrial policy, for example, around the future of semiconductors in the United States, that is an effective semiconductor industry capable of sustaining American leading edge innovation right across each new iteration of the microprocessor industry. That is what I describe as an industrial policy which is too cold. Wherein lies the golden mean of just right? That is a difficult question, both against the potential misallocation of public resources within the economy, but also against the core criteria of what is most likely to produce the end result, which is a continued technological edge. I think there is also this broader question, Anna, which is what impact does this overall shift in China's economic policy centre of gravity have on China's overall long-term economic growth rate? And what impact does that in turn have on its global economic race against the United States? And while I did not touch on this in my oral remarks before, when I produced the written text of this speech, the last section of it deals with where does this all take us in the decade ahead? If I could sketch that out very briefly, it's often been our assumption when we've looked historically at China's rise to project ahead, almost in semi-linear fashion, Chinese historical growth rates forever and forever and forever. That is, back in the first decade of the century, when China's economic growth averaged 10% or double digits, that we should be projecting ahead 10% ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Well, if that was the case, we'd be producing a Chinese economy which would ultimately be 90% of the world. Secondly, let's look at the last decade. Well, average growth rates in the last decade are closer to 6. So do we project that ahead for the decades ahead? Open question, given China is now struggling to reach 6. Its official target is 5.5. The IMF says it's 4.3, and the private economists are saying somewhere between 2 and 3. This is where it starts to become materially relevant in terms of the aggregate size of the Chinese economy in the future. What are the principal drivers of economic growth and size of GDP? There are 3 of them: population, workforce participation, and productivity. On population, China's population in total is likely to peak, if it hasn't already, sometime between 2022 and 2027, and will begin to slide back towards 1 billion by mid-century, from 1.4 where it is now. And there are debates about the extent to which it will slide, but there's no debate about it sliding. And this is the unavoidable structural consequence of the one-child policy generations ago. And secondly, the aging of the population rapidly. And thirdly, because Chinese women are engaging in an extraordinary marriage strike at the moment, which we can discuss at greater length in a different context. But the consequence is the natural birth rate now is something like about 1.47, lower than many other countries in Asia, which have achieved already high levels of economic development. The reason I dwell on this is that it's a big factor in the overall economic growth equation. The second factor is workforce participation. Chinese workforce peaked in aggregate size in 2014. Even if you removed the retirement age or amended it in some way, it's unlikely that you're going to have higher levels of workforce participation in the future because it's shrinking so rapidly. Thirdly, productivity. The growth numbers for China's productivity growth, that is the unit, the level of production per unit of productive capacity, either as total factor productivity or as labour productivity, is also declining. it's barely bumping along at 1%. That's considerably less than what the United States generates by way of productivity growth. And the United States is a mature, fully developed, advanced economy. So if you have problems on population, workforce participation, and productivity growth, and at the same time you're pushing the overall levers of China's economic growth model to the left and denying more headroom for the private sector and the market to add both productivity and growth, then it begins to point in the direction of a much slower growth rate for the long term, not just in the near term. And if that is the case, does the Chinese economy, measured as GDP at market exchange rates, really surpass the United States, as most of us have been projecting, by about 2030? Or does Uncle Sam get to breathe again? Well, it depends a bit what Uncle Sam does, because if Uncle Sam goes heavy-duty industrial policy, goes heavy-duty protectionist, and deprives itself of normal additional levels of economic growth in order to pursue these other political objectives, then maybe the Chinese will prevail, notwithstanding their own, as it were, slowing economic growth rate. But we are now down to a position where China, for structural reasons and for policy reasons under Xi Jinping's Marxist-Leninist ideology, is slowing and is likely to slow for the medium term and even into the rest of the 2020s. The question for the United States is, what does it then do? These have profound economic and geostrategic implications for the world. If the United States economy emerges by 2032 as still the largest economy in the world, maybe just, or if the Chinese economy is just larger than the American economy, but not by much, the assumptions that the United States would in the future be dwarfed by China, or even the United States plus Europe would be dwarfed by China, then I think we're looking at a different series of assumptions for the future. And I've noticed some literature emerging on this subject in the last several months, including by Dan Rosen most recently in his article in Foreign Affairs. Back to you. I'm sorry for taking so long on that one, Anna. But
that was excellent. Thank you. I think what you've just walked us through in terms of the workforce participation numbers and the future for that, as well as struggling productivity rates. When you couple that with things like the 16% unemployment rate for recent college graduates, which is really striking to me, it seems like all of this indicates that Xi's policies are having a more dramatic negative impact on economic growth in China than may meet the eye. And certainly the foreign private sector seems to have flagging confidence in the Chinese economy as well. There was a recent European Chamber of Commerce survey released that indicated that nearly 80% of respondents felt that China was a less attractive investment destination as a result of its more stringent COVID-19 restrictions. Half of all European expats living in China at the start of the pandemic have reportedly since left the country. Can China's economy thrive without robust confidence and engagement from the foreign business community?
Xi Jinping's self-sufficiency model and what he has called more broadly his dual circulation economy model, which is greater economic activity generated by domestic private demand, less activity being generated by net exports, in order to reduce China's growth dependency on international exports and access to international markets and even access to foreign direct investment or portfolio investment. That's a Chinese, as it were, strategic wish list for the medium to long-term future. It doesn't provide, in my judgment, a substitute for continued significant foreign capital inflow and net exports, which are needed, frankly, this year, next year, and the several years to come in order for China to sustain its growth rates. So therefore, when you look at those surveys, like the one that you just referred to from the European Chamber of Commerce, and the fact that you now see a series of either reshoring or alternative offshoring arrangements in the rest of Southeast Asia from continued manufacture in China, this will have a significant effect on China's growth trajectory. So, being good dialecticians in a Marxist-Leninist sense, the Chinese have anticipated this problem, and through the dual economy, dual circulation model, and more broadly, economic self-sufficiency, are seeking to engineer an outcome for China which lands it more safely if, in fact, you have all this reshoring of foreign direct investment, if you have net capital outflow, and if you have politically inspired trade, financial and technology embargoes in the future. But I'm not sure it's going to work quickly enough if, in fact, even at a theoretical, it works at all. I have a deep suspicion that when people embark upon, quote, national self-sufficiency, that somehow that automatically ends in success. Well, if DPRK, North Korea, represents the ultimate self-sufficiency model, I suppose that's one outcome, but it's not the way in which China became wealthy under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, or Hu Jintao. I'll leave my remarks there, Anna.
I think that's a great note to end on, because of course it's not the way that the United States or many other nations became wealthy either. So as many differences as we may have in terms of our economic models and practices, we have some profound common ground when it comes to the utility and proven benefits of relatively open market economies and engagement. Thank you so much, Kevin. I know that there was a lot more ground that we could potentially have covered, but a lot of complexity introduced here that I think policymakers should be thinking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna, and my greetings to everybody who's joined us from around the world. And this will be one part of a series of quarterly updates on China's political economy between now through until the 20th Party Congress. And we'll see what happens then. Thank you, Anna, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us from around the world.